I wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble found me anyway. It all started with a text that popped up on Claire's phone late one night while she was in the shower. I wasn't snooping, I swear, I was just moving her phone off the counter so I could plug mine into charge. That's when I saw it. I had an amazing time last night. Can't stop thinking about you. For a second, I stood there like an idiot, trying to process what I'd just read. My first instinct was to believe it was a mistake, maybe a wrong number. But who was I kidding? It wasn't a wrong number. And the more I stared at that message, the more the ground seemed to drop out from under me. It didn't take long for the flood of questions to hit. Who was this from? What amazing time was he talking about? My mind raced back to the night before. Claire had told me she was at a late work meeting, some kind of client dinner she couldn't get out of. I hadn't thought twice about it. Why would I? We'd been married for nearly 9 years, and I never had a reason to doubt her. Until now. I unlocked her phone, hands shaking, and went straight to her messages. There was the thread, her and some guy named Eric. I didn't know an Eric. He wasn't one of her colleagues, wasn't one of our friends. Hell, I hadn't even heard her mention his name before. As I scrolled through their conversation, my stomach turned. It wasn't just one message. It wasn't just one night. This had been going on for weeks. Maybe months. I heard the water turn off in the bathroom. Panic hit me like a truck. I locked her phone, tossed it back onto the counter, and leaned against the kitchen sink, trying to steady my breathing. What the hell was I supposed to do now? A few minutes later, Claire came down the hallway, hair wrapped up in a towel, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Hey," she said casually, "what are you doing?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her, shake her, demand answers. But I didn't. Not yet. "Nothing," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just waiting for you." What came next? I had no idea. But one thing was clear, this wasn't going to end well. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept replaying the moment I saw that message from Eric, trying to make sense of it, to find a way for it not to mean what it clearly did. But there was no escape from the truth. Claire, my wife, the woman I trusted with my life, was cheating on me. I listened to her soft breathing beside me, pretending to sleep as if nothing was wrong, and it made me sick. How long had she been lying to my face? How many times had I been a fool, believing her excuses? I needed to know. I needed proof. The next morning, I woke up before her, as usual. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at my phone, debating whether to confront her right away or dig deeper. But I wasn't ready for a confrontation, not yet. I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining things. I needed more than one text message to back up the sick feeling in my gut. That's when I decided to keep quiet and do a little investigating of my own. Claire's phone was the key, but getting access to it wasn't going to be easy. She usually had it with her or kept it locked, especially now that her work was so demanding. I couldn't just ask to borrow it again without raising suspicion, but luckily, I knew how to get around that. We had synced our devices to share data a while back, mostly to make life easier with the kids and appointments. She probably didn't even remember that her iPad and phone were still linked. That was my way in. While she was still upstairs getting ready, I grabbed the iPad from the living room and opened it. It asked for a passcode, and I froze for a second, thinking I was screwed. Then I remembered her passcode was my birthday. It had always been. I punched in the numbers and just like that, I was in. The first thing I did was check her messages again, scrolling back through her conversation with Eric. What I saw made my blood boil. There were hundreds of messages, each one worse than the last. They weren't just flirting. They were explicit, talking about all the things they had done together and all the things they were planning to do next. It hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some emotional fling or a brief lapse in judgment. This was a full-blown affair. They'd been sneaking around behind my back for months. The late work meetings, the business trips, the girls' nights, all of it had been a cover for her and Eric to be together. I kept scrolling, reading through every filthy detail, feeling like a complete idiot for not seeing it sooner. They had their little code words, using client dinners and meetings to refer to their hookups, and it made me sick to think of all the times I'd kissed her goodbye, wishing her a good night at work, while she was probably getting dressed for him. The part that hurt the most, though, was when I saw how she talked about me. Eric had asked her once why she was still with me. Her reply was brutal: "He's a good dad and keeps the house running. I don't love him like I used to, but it's easier to stay for now." Easier to stay for now. That's what I was to her, convenient. I wasn't her husband, her partner, or the man she loved. I was just someone who made her life easier, a placeholder while she messed around with some guy she barely knew. The rage I felt was like nothing I'd ever experienced. I had to bite my tongue, my lip, anything to stop myself from storming upstairs and confronting her right then and there. But that wouldn't have accomplished anything. Not yet. I needed more. I needed to know everything. So I kept looking. I opened her email, and there it was, more proof. Receipts for hotel bookings, confirmations for expensive dinners she'd claimed were work-related. She even had photos saved, hidden in a folder titled Work Stuff. I opened it and found pictures of them together. Some were innocent enough, selfies in restaurants or bars, but others were far from it. There were pictures of them in bed, naked, grinning like they didn't have a care in the world. I stared at those pictures for a long time, letting the reality sink in. Claire wasn't the woman I thought she was. The life I thought we had built together was a lie. The woman I had loved for almost a decade had been living a double life, and I was the fool who didn't see it. By the time I heard her footsteps coming downstairs, I had seen enough. I locked the iPad and tossed it back on the couch, forcing myself to act normal as she walked into the kitchen. "Morning," she said with a smile, grabbing a mug and pouring herself some coffee like it was any other day. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep the disgust out of my voice. Every part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to shout and scream and let all the anger and pain out. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I played along. I let her kiss me on the cheek, let her make small talk about her plans for the day, let her pretend like everything was fine. I needed more time, more proof. I couldn't rush this. Not if I wanted to come out of this with my dignity intact. As she left for work, I made up my mind, I was going to follow her. If she thought she could keep living this double life, she was wrong. I was going to catch her in the act. No more guessing, no more wondering. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The idea of following my wife like some private investigator felt ridiculous at first, but after what I'd seen on her phone, I didn't care. I needed to know how deep this betrayal went. So I waited. I spent the rest of the day pretending like everything was normal, doing the usual things, getting the kids to school, answering work emails, making dinner plans, all while mentally preparing myself for what I knew was coming. When Claire got home that night, she didn't seem any different. Maybe a little more distant, but nothing that stood out. She told me she had another work meeting the next night, another late one. I nodded, pretending to understand, pretending to believe her. Inside, though, I was seething. I knew exactly where she'd be going. The next day came, and I could barely focus. Every time I looked at Claire, I felt the anger bubbling up inside me, threatening to explode. But I kept it in check. I had to. I couldn't blow this now. That night, when she left for her so-called meeting, I waited for about 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out the door. I kept my distance, following her car through town, watching as she took a familiar route, only this time, she wasn't heading to her office. She was heading to the Marriott downtown. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard I thought I might snap it in half. I knew exactly what was happening, but seeing it unfold in front of me was something else. She parked, and I watched as she got out of the car, dressed to the nines in a way she never dressed for me anymore. She walked into the hotel, not even glancing back. I didn't follow her inside. I didn't need to. I knew what she was doing. I knew who she was with. And I knew that this wasn't going to end well for her. I didn't sleep that night. After following her to the Marriott and watching her walk inside, I parked around the corner and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't need to go in. I knew what was happening behind those walls. I didn't need any more proof. But I needed a plan. I couldn't just keep pretending. The thought of facing Claire in the morning like everything was fine made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't handle another fake smile, another lie about her late-night meetings. I had to confront her, but I couldn't do it half-assed. I needed to be smart about this. Calm. I'd seen enough guys explode and lose everything in a fit of rage, and I wasn't about to be one of them. I had to keep my head, or at least try. When I finally drove home, it was close to midnight. The house was dark, the kids long asleep. I sat in the kitchen for hours, drinking coffee, staring at the front door, waiting for her to come home. It was like waiting for a bomb to go off. My mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios, thinking of all the things I wanted to say, all the things I wanted to shout. How could she do this to me? To our kids? To us? Around 2 a.m., I heard her car pull up outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to the door open and her footsteps on the hardwood floor. She was trying to be quiet, trying not to wake anyone. Trying not to wake me. I watched as she tiptoed through the hallway, her shoes in one hand, her bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't even notice me sitting in the shadows at the kitchen table. I could see it on her face, the relief that came with thinking she'd gotten away with it again. That smug satisfaction, thinking I was too blind or too stupid to notice. I let her take a few steps toward the stairs before I spoke. Busy night? She froze. Dead in her tracks. For a second, she didn't turn around. Maybe she thought she was imagining it, but when I spoke again, there was no mistaking the tension in my voice. Must have been some meeting. You didn't get home till 2 a.m. Claire turned slowly, her face pale under the dim light from the hallway. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights, completely stunned. She hadn't expected this, not at all. I didn't think you'd still be up, she stammered, her voice shaky. I thought you'd be asleep by now. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at her, letting the silence fill the space between us. It was thick with everything I knew but hadn't said yet. She stood there, clutching her shoes like some guilty teenager sneaking in after curfew. You're gonna lie to me again, aren't you? I said finally, standing up from the table and stepping closer to her. Go on, tell me another story. Tell me how late the meeting ran, or how you had to grab a drink with a client after. I want to hear it. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not this time. Ethan, I don't know what you're. Cut the bullshit, Claire, I snapped, the anger rising in my voice. I followed you. I saw where you went. The Marriott. The fucking Marriott. So go ahead, tell me what you were really doing in that hotel for 3 goddamn hours. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stood there, frozen in place, her face contorted with guilt and panic. She was caught, and she knew it. There was no way out of this one. It's not what you think, she finally muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Oh, it's not? I shot back, my words dripping with sarcasm. So you're not fucking Eric? The guy you've been texting for months? The guy you've been sneaking around with while I'm at home with our kids? Her eyes widened, and she shook her head, but I wasn't buying it. Not for a second. Stop lying, I growled, stepping closer. I've seen the messages. I've seen the pictures. So don't stand there and insult my intelligence by pretending like this isn't exactly what I think it is. Claire's face crumpled, and she took a shaky breath, her eyes welling up with tears. But I wasn't moved. Not this time. She had lied to me over and over again, and I wasn't about to let her tears sway me now. I'm sorry, she whispered, finally breaking. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I didn't. Didn't what? I cut her off. Didn't mean for me to find out? Didn't mean for me to see the messages where you talk about how much you love him? Didn't mean to completely fuck up our marriage? Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. She didn't have an answer. Of course, she didn't. There was no excuse that could fix this. How long? I asked, my voice quieter now, but still full of rage. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, wiping at her eyes before finally answering. A few months. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of her confession sink in. Months? She'd been lying to me for months. Pretending to be the loving wife, the devoted mother, all while sneaking off to meet him. Was it worth it? I asked, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. Was he worth throwing away our entire life together? She didn't answer. She just stood there, crying, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It made me sick to see her like that. I had loved this woman. I had built a life with her, trusted her, believed in her. And now, she was nothing but a stranger to me. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said through her tears, her voice desperate. It just happened. Bullshit, I spat. It didn't just happen, Claire. You made a choice. You chose to lie to me, to cheat on me. Don't you dare try to act like this was some accident. I didn't want to hurt you, she sobbed, looking up at me with pleading eyes. I love you, Ethan. I still love you. I laughed bitterly. You love me? You've got a funny way of showing it. I do, she insisted, stepping closer, reaching out to touch my arm. I do love you. Please, Ethan, we can fix this. We can. I pulled away from her, disgusted by the very thought of her touching me. There's nothing to fix, Claire. It's done. You're done. Her face crumpled again, and she sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. But I didn't care. I didn't feel sorry for her. Not after everything she'd done. What about the kids? She whimpered, looking up at me through her tears. What are we going to tell them? That was the part that killed me. I had no idea what we were going to tell them. How do you explain something like this to your children? How do you tell them that their mother, someone they trusted, someone they loved, had betrayed their father? I wasn't ready for that conversation. But it was coming, whether I liked it or not. We'll figure it out, I said coldly, not looking at her. But right now, I need you out of this house. She looked up at me, her face wet with tears, her eyes wide with shock. What? You heard me, I said, my voice low and firm. Get your shit and get out. I don't want you here. She didn't move at first, just stared at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But when I stepped toward her, the look on my face must have convinced her I wasn't kidding. I'll go to my sister's, she mumbled, standing up shakily, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Just, please don't do anything rash. Let's talk about this when things calm down. I didn't respond. I just watched her as she stumbled upstairs to pack her things, the sound of her muffled sobs echoing through the house. When she finally left, the door closing softly behind her, I was left alone in the silence, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. This was my life now. After Claire left that night, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. The kids were still asleep upstairs, unaware of the chaos that had just blown through our lives. I sat in the dark for a long time, trying to process everything, but there was nothing to process. It was simple. She had betrayed me, and now, it was my turn to take control of the situation. I wasn't going to just sit there and let her walk away with a sob story, pretending to be the victim. No, she needed to face the consequences of what she'd done. I wasn't the kind of guy who'd throw plates against the wall or scream my head off. That wouldn't get me anywhere. But if she thought she could waltz out of our house with just a few tears and some weak apologies, she had another thing coming. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. I'd never needed one before, never thought I'd be the guy to make that call, but now, it was necessary. I wanted to know exactly where I stood. Divorce was a given at this point. There was no saving this marriage. It was done the moment she stepped into that hotel with Eric. But I wanted to make sure she didn't get to take anything more from me than she already had. The house, the kids, everything was on the line now. I didn't waste time. The next morning, I took the day off work and headed straight to my lawyer's office. I explained everything, what I had found, how long the affair had been going on, all the proof I had gathered. Emails, texts, hotel receipts, pictures. The works. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but I could see he wasn't surprised. He had probably seen this exact scenario 100 times over. That didn't make it any easier for me, though. Okay, he said finally, leaning back in his chair. Here's the deal, Ethan. Given the situation, you've got a solid case for a divorce. But I have to warn you, it's going to get ugly. I don't care how ugly it gets, I said, my voice cold. She's not walking away with my house. She's not taking my kids. He nodded. I get it. But the courts don't always work that way. Judges tend to favor joint custody unless there's a serious issue. You're not going to walk away with full custody unless you've got something that proves she's an unfit mother. Adultery won't cut it on its own. That hit me like a punch to the gut. I had all this evidence, all these disgusting details, and it still might not be enough to keep her from being around my kids. The thought of sharing custody with her, letting her have any say in their lives after what she'd done, made me sick. But I wasn't giving up that easily. What about the house? I asked. He raised an eyebrow. That's a bit more straightforward. You've been the primary breadwinner, right? That puts you in a better position to keep the house, especially if she's the one who cheated. But she might fight for it. It'll depend on what she wants out of this. I'm not losing this house, I said, my jaw clenched. I'll sell it before I let her live here without me. We went over the next steps, the paperwork, the filing process, what I could expect in terms of a timeline. He warned me again that it could get messy, especially if Claire decided to lawyer up and fight back. But I was ready for it. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. When I got home that afternoon, I started putting my plan into action. First, I made sure the kids were still in the dark. I couldn't let them get caught up in this mess, not yet. Claire and I would have to figure out how to break the news to them, but that wasn't happening until I had things under control. The next step was to protect what was mine. I knew Claire had her own bank account, but would always shared everything else, savings, credit cards, bills. I wasn't about to let her drain our joint account for some fantasy life with Eric. So I logged in and started moving money around. I transferred most of our savings into a new account, one with my name on it only. I left enough in the joint account to cover basic expenses, but not much else. She wasn't going to get rich off of me. I changed the passwords on all our shared accounts, utilities, streaming services, even the grocery delivery. She had no right to anything that we'd built together. As far as I was concerned, she'd forfeited that when she decided to screw around behind my back. Once I'd locked everything down, I turned my attention to the house. I didn't want her walking in whenever she felt like it, acting like she still had a place here. So, I had the locks changed. I called up a locksmith, told him it was an emergency, and had new keys in my hand by the end of the day. When Claire came back, she wasn't getting through that door without my permission. That night, I sat down and started documenting everything. Every text, every email, every picture I'd found, I printed them all out and filed them away. I wasn't about to let her weasel her way out of this. If it came down to it in court, I wanted to be prepared to lay out every sordid detail in front of the judge. I wasn't holding anything back. Claire didn't show up that night. I wasn't sure if she was staying at her sister's or at Eric's, and frankly, I didn't care. The longer she stayed away, the better. I needed space to think, to plan. The next day, around noon, I got a text from her. Just a simple message, "We need to talk." I stared at it for a while, feeling the anger rise up again. After everything, now she wanted to talk? Now that she was caught, she thought we could just sit down and hash it out? I wasn't interested in talking. I wanted to watch her squirm. So, I didn't respond. I ignored her text, left her hanging, wondering what was going on. If she thought she was going to waltz back in and have a civil conversation about how to work things out, she was in for a rude awakening. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I heard a knock at the door. I didn't have to guess who it was. Claire stood there, looking like she hadn't slept in days, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. "I texted you," she said, her voice shaky. "I saw," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. Didn't feel like responding. Can we talk?" She looked so pitiful, standing there with her shoulders slumped, like she was the one who'd been wronged. "You want to talk?" I stepped aside, letting her in. "Fine. Let's talk." She walked in slowly, glancing around the house like she was checking to see if anything had changed. Maybe she was hoping I'd thrown a tantrum and trashed the place. But no, everything was just as it was when she left, only now, it was mine. "Why did you change the locks?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do you think?" I shot back. "You don't live here anymore, Claire. This is my house. You want to get in? You ask." She flinched at that, biting her lip like she was holding back more tears. I didn't care. I wasn't in the mood to comfort her. Not after what she'd done. "I just want to explain." "Explain what?" I interrupted, my voice hard. "Explain how you lied to me for months? How you snuck around with him while I was at home with the kids? Go ahead, Claire. I'm dying to hear your explanation." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she muttered. "I never meant for it to go this far." I laughed bitterly. "That's rich. You didn't mean for it to happen? You didn't mean to fuck him behind my back for months? You didn't mean to destroy our marriage?" "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling. It was just what, Claire?" I snapped, cutting her off again. "A mistake? A little fling? Something that just happened?" I stepped closer to her, glaring down at her with all the anger and betrayal I'd been holding in. "You don't get to play the victim here. You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it." Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me with her tears. She started, but her voice broke, and she didn't finish. "You just what?" I pressed. "You just didn't think I'd find out? Or did you just not care if I did?" She shook her head, her whole body trembling now. But I didn't stop. "I've got everything documented," I said coldly. "The messages, the pictures, all of it. So don't even think about trying to play nice in the divorce. You're not walking away with my kids, and you're not taking this house. You can forget that right now." Her eyes widened at that, and she looked like she was about to say something, but I wasn't finished. "Now get out," I growled. "And don't come back unless I say you can." She stood there for a moment, staring at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her anymore. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't recognize myself, either. But I didn't care. Without another word, Claire turned and walked out the door. I locked it behind her, listening to her sobs fade into the night. The revenge had only just begun. With Claire out of the house and my plan already set in motion, I turned my attention to the man who'd wrecked my marriage. Eric. He wasn't some faceless shadow anymore. He wasn't just a name in Claire's texts or a figure in the pictures. He was real now, and I was going to make him feel every bit of the destruction he had brought into my life. I knew where Eric worked. Claire hadn't exactly been secretive about that. He was a mid-level manager at some real estate development firm downtown. Big shot, but not too big to avoid my reach. The more I thought about him, the more furious I became. He was walking around free, living his life, probably laughing at me with Claire, thinking they'd gotten away with it. That wasn't going to happen. Not on my watch. I wanted to hit him where it hurt. Humiliate him. Make him feel like the piece of trash he was. I wasn't going to roll up on him and throw a punch, as tempting as that was. No, physical violence wasn't my style. But ruining his life? That was something I could get behind. And I had plenty of ways to do it. First, I started digging. I needed to know more about him, his weaknesses, his secrets, his past. Lucky for me, I work in IT. Finding information on people isn't exactly difficult when you know where to look. I spent the next few days gathering every scrap of intel I could find on Eric. I knew his full name, his job, where he lived, and a little about his family. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to go deeper. I found his social media accounts, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. All of them were locked down pretty tight, but that didn't stop me. A little digital finesse, and I had access to everything. His Facebook was full of the usual crap: vacation pictures, nights out with friends, the occasional humble brag about work. His Instagram was the same, though there were more selfies of him in front of fancy cars and expensive dinners. Typical douchebag behavior. But what really caught my eye was his LinkedIn profile. He'd been with his company for about 6 years, slowly working his way up the ladder. His posts were full of professional nonsense, patting himself on the back for his strong leadership and outstanding performance. The guy was clearly full of himself, but that wasn't what interested me. What I wanted was something I could use to tear him down. I found it in the form of a woman named Laura. Laura worked at the same company as Eric, and judging by the comments she left on his posts and the pictures they were tagged in together, they were more than just colleagues. They'd been involved at some point, probably before Claire came into the picture. Maybe even during. I wasn't sure yet, but I knew I had to reach out to her. She was my way in. I created a fake LinkedIn profile, nothing too fancy, just something believable enough to not raise any red flags. I connected with her under the guise of being a business consultant and sent her a friendly message, complimenting her work and asking if she'd be open to discussing some potential opportunities. She bit almost immediately, agreeing to chat over email. That's when I dropped the bomb. I told her I'd recently learned about Eric's affair with my wife and that I thought she might want to know about it. I sent her screenshots of some of the texts between Claire and Eric, just enough to prove I wasn't bluffing, but not so much that I tipped my hand too early. I played the part of the heartbroken husband, looking for answers and warning her about what kind of guy Eric really was. Her response was almost immediate. She thanked me for telling her, said she'd suspected something was off with Eric for a while but hadn't been able to prove it. She was pissed, angry at Eric, angry at herself for being involved with him in the first place. She didn't go into detail about their relationship, but it was clear she'd been burned by him, too. That was exactly what I needed. A scorned woman is a powerful ally. Laura and I stayed in touch over the next few days, exchanging more information about Eric and his dirty little secrets. She told me about how he'd manipulated her, made her feel special, only to drop her when someone better came along. It was classic behavior for a guy like him, using people, then tossing them aside when they no longer served a purpose. With Laura on my side, I had everything I needed to start making Eric's life a living hell. I started with his job. Laura mentioned that their boss was a no-nonsense guy, someone who valued loyalty and honesty above all else. He wouldn't take kindly to finding out that one of his managers was screwing around with a married woman, especially not if it was happening during work hours. So, I made sure he found out. I drafted an anonymous email detailing Eric's affair with Claire, attaching the evidence I'd gathered: texts, pictures, even some of the hotel receipts. I made it clear that this had been going on for months and that Eric was using company time and resources to conduct his little love affair. I wasn't sure how much of that was true, but it didn't matter. I knew it would raise enough questions to put Eric in the hot seat. Within a day of sending the email, Laura confirmed that Eric had been called into a meeting with HR. She didn't know all the details, but from what she heard, it wasn't going well for him. He'd been put on some kind of performance review, which was HR's way of saying they were watching him closely. If he screwed up even once, he was done. That was step 1. Step 2 was personal. I wanted to hit him where it really hurt: his reputation. So, I leaked the affair to his social circle. I sent anonymous messages to some of his friends on Facebook, attaching the same evidence I'd sent to his boss. Most of them didn't respond, but I knew it would get around. People love gossip, especially when it's this juicy. By the end of the week, Eric's name was mud. Word had spread throughout his company and his friend group. He was being ostracized, shunned by people who didn't want to associate with a guy who'd been caught cheating with a married woman. And the best part? Claire didn't know any of this was happening. She was still in the dark, thinking she could sweep everything under the rug and move on with her life. I wasn't done yet, though. I wanted Eric to feel the same helplessness, the same powerlessness that I'd felt when I found out about the affair. So, I hit him where he couldn't defend himself, his personal life. Through some digging, I found out that Eric had a lease on a fancy apartment downtown. He lived alone, no roommates, no significant other. Just him and his ego. I also found out that he had a pretty tight schedule. He worked long hours during the week, but his weekends were mostly spent at the gym, followed by drinks with friends. That gave me a window of opportunity. I waited until I knew he wouldn't be home, then paid a visit to his building. It wasn't hard to get in. People are way too trusting when it comes to letting strangers into secure buildings. A quick "oh, I forgot my key" was all it took to get one of his neighbors to buzz me in. Once I was inside, I headed straight for his door. I didn't break in. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't going to risk jail time over this asshole. But I did leave him a little surprise. I printed out every single piece of evidence I had, every text, every picture, every hotel receipt. I stuffed them all into a large envelope, sealed it, and taped it to his front door with a note that simply said, "I know." When Eric came home that night, he'd find everything laid out for him. All the dirty details of his affair, all the proof of his betrayal. I wanted him to know that he wasn't safe, that someone was watching him, and that his little secret wasn't so secret anymore. The next morning, I got a text from Laura. "Eric's losing it," she wrote. "He's freaking out, saying someone's trying to ruin his life. He thinks it's Claire's husband." I smiled to myself. That was the point. But I wasn't done yet. Eric needed to feel real consequences, not just embarrassment. I wanted him to lose more than his reputation. I wanted him to lose something tangible. I waited a few days before making my next move. Then, I reached out to a private investigator I knew, a guy who specialized in digging up dirt on people. I didn't want to destroy Eric's life outright. I just wanted him to feel like his world was falling apart, piece by piece. The investigator found what I was hoping for: a couple of unpaid parking tickets, some suspicious charges on his credit card, and a few questionable business deals. Nothing major, but enough to raise eyebrows if they were exposed. I packaged everything together and sent it to the IRS, making sure they knew exactly where to look if they wanted to audit him. It was a slow burn, but I knew it would catch up to him eventually. And when it did, he wouldn't know what hit him. I wasn't trying to destroy him all at once. That would have been too easy. I wanted Eric to suffer, to feel the walls closing in on him, little by little, until there was nothing left. By the end of it, Eric would be a shell of the man he once was. Just like I had been. And I wasn't even sorry. Days passed, and Claire stayed away from the house. Part of me expected her to come begging, to try to win me back with more of her fake tears and excuses. But she stayed quiet. Maybe she knew there was no point, or maybe she was just too wrapped up in whatever fallout she was dealing with from Eric. It didn't matter. The silence was a relief. But I knew we couldn't avoid each other forever. There were things to be dealt with, legal things, practical things, and, most importantly, the kids. They were still oblivious to what was going on, though I could see the questions forming in their eyes. They weren't stupid, and it wasn't fair to leave them in the dark much longer. I dreaded that conversation. Telling your kids that their mother had blown up their family is not the kind of thing you ever prepare for. But I had to do it. I had to be the one to break it to them, and I had to do it soon. The clock was ticking. One evening, after I'd put the kids to bed, my phone buzzed. I picked it up and saw her name on the screen, Claire. I hadn't heard from her since the night I kicked her out, but here she was, finally reaching out. I stared at the phone for a second, debating whether or not to answer. Part of me didn't even want to hear her voice again, but the rational part of me knew we had to talk. So, I swiped the screen and put the phone to my ear. "What do you want, Claire?" There was silence on the other end for a moment, just her soft breathing. Then, she spoke, her voice quiet, almost tentative. "We need to talk," she said. I sighed, leaning back against the kitchen counter. "About what?" "About everything. About the kids. About what happens next." I could tell she was choosing her words carefully, trying not to set me off. She was probably afraid I'd hang up on her, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. I wanted to hear what she had to say, even if it was just to confirm what I already knew. "Fine," I said, my voice flat. "Come over tomorrow night. We'll talk." She agreed, and that was that. I hung up without another word and went to bed, knowing the conversation ahead was going to be brutal. The next evening, after dinner, I told the kids that their mom was coming over to talk. I didn't tell them why. I wasn't ready to have that conversation just yet, not until I'd gotten a better handle on what Claire's angle was. They nodded, a little confused but not suspicious. They were used to their mom working late or being gone for a few days for work trips. This wasn't all that different in their eyes. Claire arrived around 8 p.m. When she knocked on the door, I opened it and stood there for a second, taking her in. She looked different, tired, worn out. There was no makeup on her face, no fake smile, no pretenses. Just her, standing there with her shoulders slumped, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her back. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. She walked in slowly, glancing around the house as if she was seeing it for the first time in years. It was a strange moment, watching her in our home, the place we'd built together, knowing that everything had changed. Nothing would ever be the same again. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had countless dinners and conversations over the years. Only now, there was an invisible wall between us, a distance that would never be bridged. "Ethan," she began, her voice shaky, "I'm sorry." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're sorry? That's all you've got?" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on the table. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you or the kids. I just..." "Stop," I cut her off, my voice cold. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't care why you did it. You made your choice, Claire. You chose to lie to me. You chose to betray our family. So don't sit here and pretend like you're some kind of victim." She looked down at her hands, tears welling up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I wasn't going to fall for her act again. "I know I messed up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I still love you, Ethan. I love our family. Can't we try to fix this?" I stared at her, incredulous. "You want to fix this? You've got to be kidding me. You've been screwing around behind my back for months, and now that you've been caught, you think we can just patch things up and move on?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Ethan, I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose everything. I don't want to lose the kids." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The kids. That was the one part of this whole mess that I hadn't fully wrapped my head around yet. It wasn't just about me and her, it was about them. They were the ones who were going to suffer the most from this, and that realization made my anger flare up all over again. "I'm not keeping the kids from you," I said, my voice strained. "But we're not staying together. This marriage is over." Her face crumpled at that, her body shaking with sobs. "Please, Ethan, can't we just try?" "Try what, Claire? Try to pretend like you didn't tear our family apart? Try to ignore the fact that every time I look at you, I'll remember what you did? No. There's no coming back from this." She sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. I sat there, watching her, feeling nothing but cold detachment. I'd already mourned the loss of our marriage. The Claire I thought I knew was gone. This version of her, broken and pathetic, was just a stranger sitting at my table. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes and looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "What do we tell the kids?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "We'll tell them the truth, as much as they need to know. We'll tell them we're getting a divorce and that it's not their fault. They don't need to know the details." She nodded slowly, sniffling. "When?" "Soon," I replied. "We can't keep putting it off. They deserve to know what's going on." She swallowed hard and nodded again, her eyes red and swollen. "Okay." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging between us. There was nothing left to say, nothing that would change the outcome. We both knew it. This was the end. Eventually, Claire stood up, wiping her face again. "I'll pack some more things and leave. I'll stay with my sister for now." I nodded, watching as she moved slowly through the house, collecting some clothes and personal items. When she came back downstairs, she hesitated at the door, glancing back at me. "Ethan," she began, but I shook my head. "Don't," I said firmly. "Just go." She opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. I didn't watch her leave. I just closed the door behind her and leaned against it, letting out a long, exhausted breath. It was over. The last shred of hope or uncertainty had been snuffed out. Whatever had existed between us was dead now, and there was no reviving it. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that it was finally done, and sadness for everything that could have been but never would be. The next morning, after the kids had finished their breakfast, I sat them down in the living room. Claire had already left by the time they woke up, and I knew it was time to have the talk I'd been dreading. I looked at them, two innocent faces, full of life, completely unaware of what was coming. My heart ached for them. This wasn't fair. They didn't deserve this. "Listen, guys," I began, my voice steady but soft. "I need to talk to you about something important." They looked at me, confused, but they didn't say anything. They just waited for me to continue. "Your mom and I, we're getting a divorce." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I watched as their faces changed, first confusion, then shock, then the beginnings of sadness. "Why?" my daughter asked, her voice small and fragile. I sighed, trying to find the right words. "It's complicated, sweetheart. But it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Your mom and I, we just can't be together anymore." Tears welled up in both of their eyes, and it broke me. I pulled them into a hug, holding them tightly as they cried into my chest. There was nothing I could say to make it better, nothing I could do to take away their pain. All I could do was be there for them and try to help them through it. Claire might have shattered our family, but I wasn't going to let her take everything from me. I'd fight for the kids, for their well-being, and for whatever scraps of normalcy we could salvage from this wreckage. The marriage was over, but I still had them. And that was all that mattered now. After the kids finally calmed down, I sat there in silence, letting everything sink in. Their small, fragile bodies curled into mine, both of them trying to make sense of the bomb I'd just dropped. They didn't deserve this, no kid ever does. But it was their reality now, the same way it was mine. Claire had made sure of that. For a long time, I just held them, stroking their hair, feeling the weight of their tiny breaths against my chest. I'd promised myself that I wouldn't break down in front of them, that I'd stay strong. But it was harder than I thought. Their pain was worse than anything I'd been through. Seeing the confusion, the hurt in their eyes, it cut deeper than Claire's betrayal ever could. Once they'd settled, I helped them get ready for bed. They were quiet, still processing everything I told them. I didn't push for conversation. I figured they'd ask their questions when they were ready. I just needed to be patient and give them space. They were smart kids, they'd figure things out on their own time. After tucking them in, I stood in their bedroom doorway for a minute, just watching them. They looked so small, so vulnerable. This was going to change everything for them, and I couldn't protect them from it. That was the hardest part, knowing that I couldn't shield them from the pain of what was happening. But I'd be damned if I let Claire's mistakes mess them up. I'd do whatever it took to keep them stable, to make sure they knew they were still loved. That was my priority now. As I turned to leave, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The conversation with Claire, telling the kids, filing for divorce, all of it had taken a toll. But now, with the worst of it over, I could finally start moving forward. The anger, the pain, it was still there, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. I could see a path forward, even if it was covered in debris from the life Claire had smashed to pieces. I walked downstairs, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Claire had sat across from me just the night before, crying, begging for forgiveness. It felt like that conversation had happened years ago, not hours. So much had shifted since then. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. It wasn't the place I'd shared with Claire for all those years. It was mine now, and it was going to stay that way. I wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: Claire wasn't a part of it anymore. As I took a sip of my beer, I thought about how quickly everything had unraveled. Just a few weeks ago, I was clueless, blissfully unaware that my wife had been leading a double life. Now, here I was, on the verge of starting over. It felt surreal. But in some strange way, I felt a sense of relief. The truth was out. There were no more lies, no more pretending. I knew where I stood, and I knew what I had to do next. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but at least it was clear. I wasn't planning on giving Claire any second chances. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. As far as I was concerned, the woman I'd married was gone. I didn't even recognize the person she'd become. The Claire I knew, the Claire I'd loved, wouldn't have done what she did. The woman who stood on my doorstep, crying and begging, she was a stranger. The next few days passed slowly. Claire came by to see the kids, but she didn't try to talk to me. She seemed to understand that the door was closed, at least as far as our marriage was concerned. We'd both agreed to tell the kids together that we were divorcing, but after that, I didn't need to see her unless it was about the kids. I wasn't going to waste my time listening to more of her apologies or excuses. She'd had her chance to explain, and she'd blown it. I focused on getting the paperwork in order. My lawyer had everything ready to go, and I wasn't wasting any time. I wasn't looking for a drawn-out battle, but I also wasn't going to let Claire walk away without consequences. The house was staying mine, and I'd make sure the kids stayed with me as much as possible. I was prepared for her to put up a fight, but surprisingly, she didn't. When Claire finally sat down with the kids and me to explain the situation, she was surprisingly calm. It was one of the few moments where I saw a glimpse of the woman I used to know. She spoke softly, trying to reassure them, but the kids weren't stupid. They knew something had been wrong for a while, even if they didn't fully understand what it was. "I know this is hard," Claire said, her voice shaking just a little. "But your dad and I, we're not going to be together anymore." The kids just looked at her, not saying anything. I could see them trying to process the words. My son, always the quieter one, just nodded, his face blank. My daughter, though, stared at Claire with wide, teary eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire hesitated, glancing at me for help. But I wasn't going to bail her out. This was her mess to explain. "It's complicated," Claire said, looking down at her hands. "But just know that it's not because of you. Your dad and I, we've just grown apart." I almost laughed at that. Grown apart was the understatement of the century. But I bit my tongue, not wanting to make things worse for the kids. They didn't need to know the full story. Not yet, anyway. After the conversation, Claire hugged them both tightly, tears streaming down her face again. I watched her, feeling nothing. I was done with her, emotionally and mentally checked out. All that was left now were the logistics of separating our lives. Over the next few weeks, Claire and I worked out a custody arrangement. It was messy at first, but eventually, we settled on something that worked for the kids. They'd spend most of their time with me, but Claire would have weekends and some holidays. I didn't like the idea of her having that much access to them, but the courts favored joint custody, and I wasn't going to put the kids through an ugly battle. I wasn't fighting for full custody, but I was making sure they knew who their primary parent was going to be. Me. As for the house, it was mine. Claire didn't even try to fight me on it. Maybe she knew she didn't have a leg to stand on, or maybe she just wanted to wash her hands of the whole thing. Either way, I got what I wanted. I'd keep the place, raise the kids here, and build a new life for us. Claire moved into a small apartment across town, and I didn't care what she did after that. As long as she kept her distance from me, she could do whatever she wanted with her life. Whether she stayed with Eric or found some new idiot to latch onto, it didn't matter. She was out of my life for good. Once the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange sense of closure. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been quick, but it was done. I was free. The weight of the last few months lifted off my shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The kids adjusted as best as they could. There were tough days when they missed their mom, days when they didn't understand why things had to change. But we got through it, one step at a time. I made sure they knew I was there for them, that no matter what happened between Claire and me, I wasn't going anywhere. As for me, I took things day by day. I wasn't thinking about the future yet, not in any real sense. I wasn't ready to dive back into the dating world, and I wasn't interested in trying to find myself or any of that crap. I just wanted to be a good dad, to keep things steady for the kids. Everything else could wait. I didn't think much about Claire anymore. When I did, it wasn't with anger or sadness, just indifference. She'd made her choice, and I'd made mine. Our paths had diverged, and that was the end of it. There was no going back. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. And that was enough for now.